Hi, I'm Amy Bodkin. I'm an autistic adult and former school psychologist, and now I work as a consultant with my business, Amy Bodkin Consulting. I work worldwide with families who have a variety of needs. Sometimes it's trauma or even adoption. Adoption can be a form of trauma, or it could be medical trauma. Preemies experience medical trauma. I also work with families who have developmental or learning differences, or genetic differences, physical health differences, um, any kind of disability, long-term health implications. Sometimes it's the parent that's got the long-term health issues, but no matter who it is in your family who's got something that needs a little extra TLC going on, uh, it's going to impact the whole family. And so that's why I really enjoy working with homeschool families, because we have the freedom to adapt in whatever way we need to help support our family best. So when I work with families all over the world, my favorite thing is getting to dig into what's going on in their lives. Is there something that we've missed somewhere that a child needs support with? Is there something that we need to teach differently for this kind of learner? I'm looking at all the different pieces and looking for the pattern. You might say that my special talent as an autistic person is seeing patterns. I'm very good at seeing patterns, especially in people. And so I'm looking at kids trying to figure out, okay, well, what kind of pattern are you following? Because the patterns that we follow tend to impact what our interests are, how we learn, all of those kinds of things. And when we see certain patterns, then we can kind of guess, this is probably what's going on, and this is probably what's going to help you. It's an educated guess as opposed to just a random guess. So I love getting to work with families and enjoy having time that I get to spend with families and their children online. But you can find more about me and what I do at my website, amybodkin.com. And you can find me on Facebook too. I have a Facebook group called Special Needs Homeschooling Help with Amy Bodkin EDS. But today I am talking with you guys about what Mr. Rogers and Charlotte Mason have in common. Now, some of you might be thinking, what do you mean what they have in common? Like, they were born almost 100 years apart on opposite sides of the world. One advocated for living books and the other one advocated for public television. How in the world can they have something in common? So we're going to start out talking a little bit about each of their backgrounds, kind of comparing and contrasting them, and then we're going to get down into some of the things that they had in common. Charlotte Mason was born a female, January 1st, 1842. Fred Rogers was born a male, March 20th, 1928. Charlotte Mason was born in Great Britain, while Fred Rogers was born in the United States. Now, as for their family histories, this is where it gets a little interesting and a little sticky. So Charlotte Mason's parents were Joshua Mason and Margaret Shaw. However, we haven't known a ton about her early life because she stayed rather silent about it. However, Margaret Coombs recently did some research and uncovered some possibilities. She has some evidence, but it is hard to be definitive when we're talking about people who lived over 100 years ago, who also weren't particularly well-known, famous, or well-to-do. Joshua Mason was a Quaker. He was significantly older than Margaret Shaw, and it is suspected that he had gone to Australia with his son and that his son died on the trip, and when he came back, Margaret Shaw was pregnant, and so it is suspected that perhaps instead of Joshua Mason being the father of her child, perhaps it was his son, and that he married Margaret Shaw in order to keep Charlotte Mason from not having a father, which would have been much more disastrous at that time because having a child out of wedlock was a really big deal. Uh, Margaret Shaw was Catholic. Joshua Mason was Quaker. And generally speaking, marrying someone of a faith different from yours usually didn't lead to good things. It usually ended up leaving you ostracized from your faith. So Joshua Mason was significantly older. He had had 2 wives before, and he had had children with them. So it is assumed that Charlotte Mason had half siblings, and it is also assumed that she stayed with one of those step siblings for a while, but there is very little mention of this. And again, it's very difficult to trace these kinds of facts down over 100 years later. But this is the best idea we can glean from what is known. Uh, Charlotte Mason was orphaned and impoverished at 16 years old. So she really wasn't that well-to-do to begin with, and most of her education took place at home. Fred Rogers, on the other hand, was born to James Rogers and Nancy McFeely, and he was born into an upper middle class family, and he went to school. He lived in a 3-story house. He was loved by his parents. He did seem to struggle as a young child. He seemed to spend a lot of time by himself, playing with puppets. Charlotte Mason was Anglican. So her mother was Catholic, her father was Quaker, she was Anglican. And Fred Rogers was Presbyterian. Charlotte Mason never married or had children. Fred Rogers did get married. He married Joanne. She was a talented pianist, and they had 2 sons. Charlotte Mason did eventually do teacher training at home and colonial school. Fred Rogers went to college and got a degree in music, and later was ordained as a Presbyterian minister. Charlotte Mason worked as a teacher and an educational philosopher. Fred Rogers worked as a television personality. You can see what I mean about these two seeming to be rather different. Charlotte Mason advocated for living books, and Fred Rogers advocated for public television. Both of Charlotte Mason and Fred Rogers seem to have been somewhat lonely children who suffered, but had loving parents. I suspect they suffered at the hands of other people. Both of them definitely had things that they could have been picked on for. But having loving parents can allow you to come a long ways when you go through difficult times with other people. And I think this could be what made both of them more sensitive to children as individuals. Both loved books, and both loved Shakespeare and the Bible. In Mr. Rogers' list of top 10 books, there's actually several books in his list that I have seen on Charlotte Mason homeschool curriculum, one of which is The Secret Garden. That was one of the ones on the list. Both Charlotte Mason and Fred Rogers worked to include others. Charlotte Mason definitely advocated for educating children in lower classes as well. And she also advocated that children are born persons and that they're not born good or bad. And a lot of this is thought to have been linked back to how children born out of wedlock were assumed to be, because they were assumed that they were bad because they were born out of sin, and that children who were not born out of wedlock were born good because they came from the right kind of parentage. She also had a friend and supporter in Henrietta Franklin. Henrietta Franklin was a Jewish woman and was one of Charlotte Mason's greatest supporters. Charlotte Mason was born at a time when England had not repealed the law requiring Jews to dress in a way that identified them. Now, this is nothing surprising or unusual for England. This had been going on all over Europe since about 500 AD, so it wasn't really anything surprising. But it didn't get repealed officially until after Charlotte Mason was born. England was being much kinder to Jews than they had been in previous centuries. But she definitely was someone who included others. I've heard in Charlotte Mason homeschool groups before that only Christians can be Charlotte Mason homeschoolers because Charlotte Mason was a Christian. And obviously, Charlotte Mason didn't feel that way if she included Henrietta Franklin. Fred Rogers also worked to include others. He had Jeffrey Erlanger on his show, and Jeffrey Erlanger was showing his electric wheelchair. He was a child with a disability, and Fred Rogers had him come on his show to talk about his disability. And this was 10 years before the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed. There were no guarantees to guarantee that people with disabilities would have access to bathrooms, public places of business, restaurants, even buildings for our government. None of those things were guaranteed before then. And quite honestly, we didn't even have special education required until 1975. And before that, children with significant disabilities were sent to institutions to live away from their parents, where very often they were abused. So this was really pretty radical for the time. He also had a guest on his show named Officer Clemens, and he had him put his feet in a little kiddie swimming pool with him to cool off his feet, and even dried off Officer Clemens' feet for him. He did this on purpose because Officer Clemens was a Black actor, and at the time, swimming pools in the United States were segregated. And this was the same year that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. So once again, Fred Rogers chose to include others in a rather radical way. Both Charlotte Mason and Fred Rogers were interested in educating children, but not just educating children as a whole person, to include their feelings, their moral guidelines that they'd live their lives by as adults, and also physically as well. This was a pretty radical idea as well. We have many shows today that are available that are educational, and many of them will focus more on ABCs and 1, 2, 3s. But as we know, educating a child is much more than the facts that they learn or even how well they can participate in sports. It is about the kind of person that they grow up to be. In philosophy, we like to say that we swing on a pendulum between faith and reason. When we swing too far to faith, we end up with things like the Crusades and the Inquisition. When we swing too far to reason, we end up finding ourselves with situations like the Holocaust or eugenics. When we can hit that sweet spot in the middle, that's really the best spot. That's where magic happens. That's when the American Revolution happened. And I believe it's why America ended up winning its independence, because it was a time of great reason, but it was also a time of great faith. And when you can combine great reason and great faith together, then sometimes you can get some amazing events in history. However, that said, if we can swing towards faith or towards reason and not get too far, we can also see some pretty amazing things. At times when Europe and America have swung harder to faith, but not too far, we've ended up with the Romantic period in Europe and the Transcendentalist period in America. And both of those time periods were times where we saw great works of literature and art and poetry, uh, and also a lot of talk about education and specifically moral education for children. And especially in the United States, due to our government style being so dramatically different, you also saw a lot of people focused on how can we become better? How can we be the best people that we can be? There was definitely a religious quality to the Romantic period that we saw in the United States because of the kind of culture that we had in the United States at that time. Charlotte Mason and Fred Rogers were really, truly both romanticists at heart that were born out of time. They weren't born during a romantic or transcendentalist time period. But I think that's why they've resonated so deeply with people, because they're offering something that people are missing. When Charlotte Mason was writing her last book, she was writing it after World War I, and she had observed how Germany had taken the educational philosophies of England and had stripped out the morality, and that is what she felt had led to World War I and the disrespecting of individuals' countries' rights to be able to govern themselves and determine what kind of a country they're going to be. Uh, and she wrote that she hoped that we had learned our lesson and that we would never see such a great loss again. And of course, as we know, we had World War II not too long after that. And once again, you see a disrespect, but not for countries this time, but for individuals, targeting some of the more vulnerable of society. Jews who do not have or did not have a country at that time to be able to protect themselves, who were often subjected to harsh treatment and even kicked out of many countries and still are not allowed in many countries. Um, you also had children with disabilities. The first time that autism was talked about was when Hans Asperger's talked to Nazis about autism. And that is why the term Asperger's is not used anymore. We aren't sure if he signed children's death warrants because he was a Nazi sympathizer or if he was trying to protect other children. Those answers have gone with him to the grave. But it is a very dark time for people with disabilities. There were many people with disabilities that were horrifically treated and also murdered. And it is one of the reasons why I encourage families to be very careful presenting World War II to children who have disabilities, because I think a lot of times people who don't identify as having a disability often don't realize how traumatic it can be to come face to face with the reality that there are people out there who do not appreciate you because of who you are, and in fact would even like to kill you. By the same token, Fred Rogers also spoke about difficult topics. And I think he was sharing with people, once again, something they were missing at the time. I've already mentioned that he used his television show to talk about racism when he had Officer Clemens come and sit with him with the kiddie wading pool. I also already talked to you about how he had Jeffrey Erlinger come on and talk about his disability and his electric wheelchair. But he also used his television show to talk about things like nuclear war, divorce, and September 11th. So whether or not you use educational television or living books, or more likely a mixture of both, I want you to keep the goals of these two giants in the lives of children at the forefront as you are educating your own children. While children don't necessarily need you to be their best friend, they do need you to treat them with the same kind of respect that you would treat your best friend, just like Charlotte Mason and Mr. Rogers did. With Mr. Rogers, we have countless hours of recorded video of him talking either on his show or directly to children. And so we can see directly that he spoke to children with the same respect and honesty that he would give to an adult friend. But he did not lean on them the way that he would an adult friend. He did not share with them more difficult topics than needed to be talked about. Yes, children need to have a trusted adult to talk about with when a favorite pet dies, or their parents are going through a divorce, or children are experiencing segregation and racism. Those are important topics to talk about. But that doesn't mean that we have to make it more explicit than we have to. And so I think that following that kind of example as we are homeschooling our children is probably one of the most important things that we can do for our children. And as I leave you with those thoughts today, I want you to remember, you always make each day a special day. You know how? By just being you. There's only one person in the whole world that's like you, and that's you. And people can like you just the way you are. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.